statistic that 80% of Asian women drop off corporate executive track. Why is that? And then when you look at the S&P 500, only 1% is of Asian descent as a CEO. And then if you look at the percentage of the world, we're 60% of the world's population. It seems so disproportionate. And then even in America, as an immigrant group, we're also the most educated, and statistically, we also have some of the highest salary bands. So it doesn't add up. The scales don't add up. And then until I kind of went through this idea of discrimination, did I start to really learn and understand these biases and perceptions and stereotypes that prevent not just Asians, but Asian women especially from coming up the corporate ladder. This idea of dispensability, disposability, like this idea of like, okay, we're made in China, there's all these kind of mass things that kind of devalues us as corporate executives. And then for women, this double notion that is so, either you're a lotus flower or like this dragon lady. You're either super obedient and quiet, or you're extremely assertive. There's no question around the quality of our work, but they think that these perceptions and these stereotypes don't make us credible people as executive leaders. So, that was part of my story. Is like, well, I don't belong to any of these stereotypes. It's definitely not who I am, and my results should, be enough to let me go there. But it's not. It took me a while to understand that it wasn't about me as a person and personally, or the lack of, confidence in my work or the quality of my work. It was simply the fact that there are these systems of power in place that prevent us from rising. And it's, when you think about it and you break it down, like, woohoo, let's go women, great. But then when you start to break it down, when you mean, okay, here's the spots for women, that means now you're competing against white women, other women of color, and then think that you put us under Asians and we're the same. We're not. It's complicated, So we have our own histories and our own frictions within the Asian community as well. And then I think there's also a very big problem around how do you define Asian in the Western world, right? Is it Chinese? Is it Indian? Is it Turkish even, or Armenian? So like there is this notion around people don't really understand or how to define it. Everyone thinks that everything East is just Asian. So it's kind of unfair, So that was the reason why I kind of wrote it, and never expected to kind of just write. It was almost like kind of like journaling, and so that was my history. And honestly, I was explaining to the other people before, I sat on the first 3 chapters for 1 year. That was pretty easy. That was setting up the idea of bias. The rest of the book was written somewhere between Christmas and January 10th this year, when I was sick and I just started hammering. And then I was sharing some of the chapters and some of the content with just some close friends and people, and they were saying that what I was writing was extremely powerful, and some of the thoughts and conversations that I was challenging were conversations and issues for now, beyond kind of what was the initial thought of race, but about what it means, like finding the new normal post-pandemic. What does it mean to go back to work? People are actually trying to fight between going back in the office 9 to 5 versus hybrid, and challenging all of these different norms. How do you come back as your true authentic self, and these true ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion after Black Lives Matter, API hate? That's just not a checkbox. And then also for women, we were the probably most impacted by the pandemic in terms of job losses, and having us come back into corporate America without the structures in place when we're caregivers, and particularly for us minorities, we live in multi-generational households and we're primarily caregivers, and there are no structures in place that even allow us to come back in critical mass, yet alone give us a fighting chance in executive level positions. Yeah.
My second question, when was the time that you realized na I got a seat at the table? Na may ganong aha moment ka ba?
May ganong aha moment pa ako.
That I have to speak. You know?
Yeah, no. Actually, for the most part, the advice that I got from my career, do not call attention to your race or gender, right? Just keep your head down.
Really?
Oh, that was the advice that I got from my career. It's like, do never call attention to your race or gender. Keep your head down. Let your work speak for itself. The moment that happened was actually during the pandemic, during Black Lives Matter, and I talk about this in the book, where my leadership actually called us. There was only like a couple of us that were people of color that were considered leaders in the practice, and they were saying, "Hey, can you help us draft a response that we can send out to the practice around Black Lives Matter?" And me and my other colleague, who is African American, were trying to help them coach into this. Tapos sabi na, oh, it would be great if we say all lives matter. So, no, 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 you can't say all lives matter.
Yeah.
Ini-explain
Yeah,
pa
yeah,
namin
yeah,
sa
yeah.
kanila. And then they said,
Oo.
oh, and then they had this idea na, oh, let's do a town hall so we can openly discuss this conversation. And so I'm like, Christine, it would be great if you can share your experience, so that people can understand, the impact of Black Lives Matter. And I said, actually, sabi ko, you shouldn't ask me, you should ask my friend Khalil to do this, right? Because he's African American, it would be more appropriate for him. They're like, no, we really want to just showcase the diversity that we have in the company. And I'm thinking, ilan lang kami? There's like
Mm.
three or
Mm.
four. And then they're like, don't worry, we'll ask another practitioner. So they went down, they asked a junior practitioner, someone who was in the very beginning of their career, two females, African American. And I said, no, I'm coming in. Parang I thought it was unfair and insensitive for them to put someone in the beginning of their career to expose themselves to that kind of vulnerability, to talk about themselves and talk about this. I said, no, I'll talk about it, but I will talk about it in the perspective of being an Asian, an ally, an immigrant, and a woman. Done. And that was kind of the perspective it is. And it was a big step for me because that was the first time that I put my vulnerability out there and called attention to those things I was told not to pay attention to instead of the merits of my work. So, and to be able to share something so personal was really kind of a point, but people really were, the people, practitioners of color, were really so supportive of what I had to do. And at that point, parang I had no choice. And when all of the violence, I was living in New York at the time, and all the violence is happening from the riots, from the Black Lives Matter movement. And I had a couple of people from my team saying, hey, I just got this, sent me a meme saying, I just saw a black man get lynched, but don't worry, I'll have those deliverables to you by tomorrow morning. Now, it was really impactful. And one of the other team members that I had as well, my team, was lived 3 blocks away in Minneapolis from the precinct. And I'm thinking, gosh, if I was feeling like I had no one to talk to, who were they going to talk to? And I kind of broke my silence from them. And that was kind of like my aha moment, like, I can't sit back. I have to take responsibility. And because I'm one of the few, it's my responsibility to bear.
Nung pumunta ka diyan sa Amerika, na-experience mo ba, or ano yung personal experiences mo ng Asian hate? Like, people call you name, like that? May mga ganun pa rin ba ngayon?
Meron pang mga ganon. Yung niece ko nga, sa New York, was in the subway. Nag-iisa siya sa subway. Tapos sinabi nung, may tao doon nag-iisa. Sabi, you ni hao ching chong, bitch. Talagang, di ba? And then, the next time I saw her, she dyed her hair blonde. So, kaya ginagawa mo, parang, sakali na kung naka-hat lang siya, naka-coat, hindi siya makatauhan na Asian. Pero, sa katotohanan, I lived in the Philippines. I grew up in the Philippines. I never thought about it as me being a minority kasi you grew up in the Philippines and you're always a majority,
Yeah.
di ba? And tapos, I grew up in a family of really strong Asian females. My lola was the first, Philippine woman in the stock exchange, right, member. And so, to me, and I went to Saint School. So I had all these really strong ideas of women that even when I went to the United States, I never questioned my gender, my race as something that was kind of barriers for that until recently. And akala ko lang while I was going through this that the discrimination and the piece that it was personal vendetta against me. He never imagined that it wasn't about the personal vendetta. Talaga that there are systems in place. There are only so many spots. They're only that they're willing to give and grant, and that statistic on the 80% of women fall off. Parang that's really it's real, And so I wanted to shed a light on it because when I was going through it, I never thought about it that way. But it still happens, and if anything else, akala mo the pandemic was worse. After the pandemic, it's even more worse now. Na the people are talking about. And the Asian hate, ang problema sa Asian, no one talks about it eh. Yung the
Yeah.
Asian hate na nangyari nung pandemic, yung API hate na ganon, was happening even before that, especially when Trump said, oh, it's the Chinese virus. And they just lump us na sa akala na magkamukha tayo, so lahat tayo in check. So, and they would put that kind of discrimination. So for me, it was really hard. And then I was working for a company at the time too, where yung coworker ko was the one who got pushed on the subway by a homeless man and died sa New York. So nung araw na nangyari yon, ang dami tumatawag sa akin, oh, are you home? Sabi ko, no, bakit? Sabi ko, Asian, senior manager, this company, ganyan, Midtown Manhattan. Baka, it could have been me. Yung description na yun could have been me. And then when I found out who it was, I was like, I wasn't that close to her, pero we were part of the same diversity. Parang, it really hit home na that this still happens. Pero yung dimension na tingin nila sa atin, right? Kasi lumalabas dito, oh, crazy rich Asian. So itong dimension na akala na mo, they're super rich or super successful, there's that. And then the complete opposite where they think that we're like mga manicurista, mga masahista, mga people, di ba? And then there's this notion of like mga tao like us, like who are actually educated, who are actually working here, who actually are trying to rise up in corporate dimensions that no one really talks about what that looks like and what the dimension is. And parang you have to question, di ba? If we're probably one of the most educated and also some of the highest income statistically from any racial group sa United States, bakit 1% lang ang CEO makeup na Asian in the S&P 500 companies? Diba? Parang the balance and the scales are not there. And then kind of going through it for me was, a lot of people are saying, the discrimination, particularly for women because you look too young, there's all of these different places that they kind of just decide to discredit you and discriminate against you based on stereotypes they don't understand, based on histories that people don't understand. That, we're not all the same. And when you say Asian, anong ibig mo sabihin?
Diba? You mentioned yung lola mo kanina. Growing up, sino pa yung mga babae na who influenced you? Bukod sa pamilya mo, pwedeng sa politics or book author ba yan? Or sino man?
Yeah, kasi, di ba, I grew up in People Power Philippines. So, obviously, the idea of a housewife to become Philippine president like Cory was pretty big, too, for me. At saka sa pamilya ko, yung lola ko, and then Evelyn Mandak is an opera singer as well, na Filipino. She was my teacher. So, marami akong female role models, and a lot of them are Filipina, very successful Filipinas. And, I've never read that was really, as a Filipina, it's really hard to question that. Okay, I talk about it in the book, diba? Sabi ko, it took like 242 years or something like that for America to elect its first black president, but hasn't elected a female president. Yeah. And the Philippines, in our 142-year-old republic, has had 2 female presidents. Parang it's off. There's something super off about it, and so, it's definitely a conversation where, we even as a culture, I would say Filipino, because that's what I can talk about, we don't have this notion that women are silent or in the background or, are not capable of, executive leadership or leadership positions or leadership roles in our community. So.
Dyan sa place nyo, strong ba yung community, yung Filipino community din?
Yeah, so I just moved to California, so there definitely is a much stronger Asian community in general as a California. Before that, I was in New York, and so there's definitely a strong community in New York, different pockets of Asian and definitely Filipino. But then when you look across majority of the United States, and I lived sometimes some Midwest, there are oftentimes nag-iisa lang ako. You can come into a restaurant, like I'm the only Asian. And so I think there are pockets, obviously, where the communities live. But I think what it is like, what you see in the States is communities that are segregated, right? So it's almost like self-segregation based on the community that you're in, kesa of really kind of like joining in mass. So
Your advice to young women who want to find their voice.
yeah, and honestly, I wrote this for the next generation, right? So I think there's a couple things. One is that we have to be very vocal about dispelling all of these stereotypes because they're not real, and some of them are rooted in a time period that no longer exists. Like, the whole lotus flower and dragon lady. The more I thought about it, it's like empirical Japan and Chinese dynasties that no longer exist or no longer applicable to today's age. And so that's one. I think the second piece of it is that we need to learn how to build community with each other and learn how to lift as we climb. I think there's also this idea that there's female rivalry, which is inherent, but also as, Asians trying to find a way to get past our histories, to help each other out and to band together as a community to really kind of help lift each other up, especially when there's one of a few. So I think the other piece of it is like men are still really important part of this conversation, and finding the right sponsors of men of quality who really believe in women's equality. And I've been lucky to have a lot of sponsors like that in my life, but they're not consistent, and we really need them to help pound the table for us. So for the younger generation, it's like dispel these myths, don't buy into those stereotypes, don't be afraid to be vocal, band together, and also find the right mentors and sponsors who are going to champion you, whether they're men or women. That's what we need to do to change the narrative and really challenge these conversations in corporate America, that you're not going to create diversity, equity, and inclusion as a checkbox on compliance, but to have a real, genuine conversation.
My last question, Christine. This went, I know nakuha mo to sa mom mo or sa lola mo. Ano yung nakita mo sa kanilang dalawa na na-apply mo rin sa sarili mo? Because you are so strong.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think yung sa lola ko, because she was at Philippine Women's Stock Exchange. She was also governor of Nueva Vizcaya. And when I was growing up with her, I was like 5, nangangampanya ako with her. And when during her funeral, it was very impactful to see truckloads of people, including the president of the Philippines at the time, honor her. And I think the way that she lived her life was really this notion of giving and being able to give yourself and being really generous and give back to your community, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to impact change. And I think to me that's something that, is important to me, is to be able to continue to live my life in purpose, but also to continue to give back in stewardship, to make sure that whatever place that I leave, whether it's a corporation or even the way that I would leave this earth, right, is a better place than when I walked in to do it. And so I think that that's really kind of what drives me from that perspective. And because I think when you the idea of giving and the people that you end up meeting in your journey, you get so much back more than you actually give. And so if there's anything else about this book, right, I hope that it's a gift to the next generation. I hope it's a gift to women of color, people of diversity, right, even our non-binary LGBTQ community, to find their voice and speak up. Because corporate America is not bad. I've built my career in corporate America. I love it so much that I'm challenging it to be better, because it has to be better for the world and where the world is going. So,
Well said. Thank you.
thank you so much. Have a good day. Salamat.
Thank you, Christine.